I'm 78 years old, sitting and waiting for death in parts of a Florida hospital, hooked up to machines and monitors which are supposed to keep me alive, but ironically, make me feel more dead than anything else. I don't have a whole lot of time left, but these past few days after chemotherapy, I've had a lot of time to think and reflect on my memories of my earlier life, in a different time and a different place. There was nothing particularly outstanding about my life. With time and age, I've forgotten most of the irrelevant parts of it. But as I lay here, one particular incident from my childhood stands out to me with frightening clarity. That even now as a geriatric, it makes me shut my eyes and clench my fists, wishing that it was only a bad dream. I was born on the island of Trinidad, in the Caribbean, relatively small but wealthy in oil and other resources. This was back in the 50s, before Trinidad was even a country of its own. Just another British colonial possession in the Caribbean. At the time, infrastructure wasn't very well developed, but I lived with my parents in the capital of Port of Spain, which was much more industrialized than the countryside, where my grandmother lived. One summer when I was 10 years old, my father, an engineer, decided that it would be a good opportunity for me to visit his mother, my grandmother, at her house in Sangre Grande, a largely rural area in the eastern part of the island. I had only heard of her every now and again, and usually through arguments between my parents. My mother wasn't very fond of Eunice Charles, or Mammy Yuen, as she was known in Creole by the family. My mother, an educated, progressive-minded woman of her time, was fiercely opposed to Mammy Yuen's superstitions and traditional view of family life. Even though they met in person only a total of 3 times at the most, my mother couldn't stand her. So when my father hatched the idea of sending me to visit her during our school vacation, she was less than pleased. I remember the night before I left. Our sizable apartment in the city was in an uproar. "You're sending him to stay with that old bat in the bush for an entire month, Wendell. What if a snake bites him, or if he falls off of a cliff? She can't take proper care of him," my mother hissed. "Would you calm down? I'm only taking him there for 2 weeks and I'll be stationed at the tracking center in Arima. That's less than an hour away by car. If anything happens, I'll be there quickly enough," my father retorted. "I still don't like this. What if she poisons my child? He isn't accustomed to that kind of countryside food that they eat. He is such a delicate boy." "Which is why this trip is perfect for him, Sandra. A couple weeks in the country outside of this hellhole of a city will do him some good. The country is changing. It would be good for him to experience at least some of the things I did as a child before it became a wasteland," my father said. I listened through the walls. I don't know why my mother and Mammy Yuen had such a bad relationship. One of my older relatives told me that it was because of something that happened when Ma was still pregnant with me. I never really questioned it, but it was strange hearing my mother talk about her mother-in-law like that. I had never heard her raise her voice like that before, so hearing it was strange. The next day, my dad loaded up his car and we were on our way out of the city, heading towards God alone knows what. We spent close to 3 hours driving on some of the worst roads in the country at the time. Over time, the asphalt from the city turned to dirt, and then to mud, and eventually, what I can only describe as sod. The telephone lines were replaced by towering palms and coconut trees, and I wondered how a woman as old as my grandmother would live in a place so remote. The villages were spread far and apart with only a few huts, dotting the lush green ocean of trees that was eastern Trinidad. The nearest neighbors were about 20 minutes away and with no telephone lines and very few vehicles. You could end up dead from something as mundane as food poisoning or a stubbed toe that got infected. I began wondering about what my mother said, and I had immediate reservations about coming here. What did I know about this woman besides the fact that she held me once when I was a few days old? My father, who was quiet the entire drive, must have seen the look of concern on my face, and he spoke up. I know that this is a new experience for you, but trust me, it'll be good for you. And getting some time away from your mother and I will be great. You'll get to see some streams and breathe some of the freshest air on the island. I can remember playing in the forest up on that side for hours when I was your age. Just don't go too far inside. Yeah, I know, there's snakes in there, I said softly. Yeah, snakes. And other things. My father's face immediately turned from happy and nostalgic to concerned. I noticed that his brow tensed. He only did that when he was in deep thought or considering a punishment for me. In hindsight, it was one of the strangest things that I had seen. After a few more minutes of driving, we finally reached a dirt track leading to a little cottage, with sheets of galvanized steel for a roof. An old woman was sitting on a small wooden bench on the gallery outside, and she waved for us to come inside. That's your Granny Yuen, he said as he smiled. You grew up here? I asked. Yep, some of the best years of my life, he said without taking his eyes off of the house. Baby boy, look how big you get. Oh my lord, I missed you so much. The woman said as she threw two frail arms around my father's shoulders, holding him in a tight embrace. She was the stereotypical Caribbean granny, wearing a long blouse with a multicolored head wrap on. Looking back, there were no distinguishing features I could describe, only that she was old, even by my understanding of age right now. Looking back, Mammy Yuen was probably pushing 90 by the time of the visit. And this must be the big man. I ain't seen you since you was a little one with your mammy, she said. Yeah, he'll be staying here with you for the next couple weeks. It'll be good for you two to get to know each other. And plus, he's never been out of the city, my father said. Is that so? Well, we have lots to see on this side, Mr. City Boy. I can't wait for you to come and go for a trail walk with me, she said. Even at her age, I could see how sprightly and full of life she was. Looking back, her courage and spirit were just a few other things I admired about her most. After a cup of cocoa and some catching up, my dad got back into his old antique Chevy, leaving me behind. Mammy Yuen took me to my room, which had a gorgeous view of the Sangre Grande horizon. In the distance, I could hear monkeys chattering and parrots squawking. I had never seen so many trees in one place before, and it was a welcome change from the dismal gray buildings and traffic congestion of the city. When you're done unpacking, you can walk around downstairs, but don't stray too far. You'll like it here, I just know it, she said warmly before setting off to get dinner started. I slipped into a pair of shorts and a button-up t-shirt before heading downstairs. I walked around in the yard and I saw that there was no fence separating Mammy Yuen's house from the forest. I walked around the towering trees and I saw large, colorful fruits hanging from them, some of which I recognized and others that I did not. While walking, I continued to hear the sounds of the forest. A few toads, some monkeys overhead, a squawk that I can only imagine a parrot made. Until I walked a little distance away and I came upon dead silence. It was odd. Not even the breeze seemed to rustle the leaves and branches in this part, and there was a hot, heavy presence in the air. The only way I can describe it was being on a packed bus at midday. But there was no one besides me around. I was about to investigate further when I heard a bell ringing in the direction of Mammy Yuen's house. I walked over and I saw her ringing the bell in the gallery. I thought that this was odd. As old as she was, I'm sure that she could have still called me. I wasn't that far away. "I'm back. How come you just didn't call me in?" I asked. "We don't call the names of the children when you're out in the bush. It invites things to follow them," Mammy Yuen said curtly before inviting me into the house. Things like what? Certainly, it couldn't be the parrots or the monkeys I saw out there. I was genuinely confused at this point, but I decided not to press it any further. At least not until after dinner when we would have more time to chat. It was at that point I realized my grandmother was a woman of many strange quirks and customs. Taking her shoes off at the front door, throwing a pinch of salt over her shoulder when cooking. Even her almost 10-minute long grace before meals prayer in Creole was something to note. Dinner was nothing short of perfect. While lounging around the living room, I saw my grandmother had a small bookcase near her rocking chair. It looked ancient and was made of shiny black wood. I remember the bookcase particularly well because, out of everything in her house, it was the only thing that seemed to shine, as if polished. On it were different versions of the Bible, a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu holy book, and various other leather-bound hard-covered books with what appeared to be scarlet red pages. Those ones interested me because I couldn't remember seeing books that size before. They were about twice the thickness of the old Bible Mammy Yuen was reading in her oil lamp right now. "You looking at the books over there?" she asked over her shoulder, not even having to take her eyes off the page she was reading. I felt a little nervous. I didn't want her to think that I was prying on her just one day into my visit. "It's okay. I can imagine that you're very curious. I don't think your mother or father would have spoken a lot about me over at your house," she said. I walked over to her and I asked, "What are all those books?" She studied my face besides the orange glow of the lamp before answering. "Knowledge of the spiritual. I'm a Catholic by birth, but it's good to read about other people's cultures and experiences with the other plane. As far as I can say, they all hold a little bit of truth in each page." I found it so profound my grandmother had such an open mind. On more than one occasion, I heard my mother refer to her as an old senile bat, but this interaction was refreshing. Suddenly, the old cabin wasn't as menacing as it was, as Mammy Yuen began giving me details of her own background. How her parents were plantation hands who could trace their ancestry back to Cameroon. How she married a drunken mule cart driver who squandered their savings, leaving only this house for her after his death. How my father got a scholarship to go abroad and furthered his life, and how despite his repeated pleas to move her to somewhere more civilized, she refuses to go. "My heart and soul is in this land. It has so much beauty and happiness out here in these fields and forests, but at the same time, there is some wickedness to it too. Not a lot, but just a little bit," she said. I could see a look of worry wash over her face in the flicker of the orange flame. And the way the shadows cast over her eyelids made her look sad. And that's when I remembered what she had told me when I first came in for my walk. "Mammy Yuen, what did you mean when you told me that calling my name might invite something in with me?" She kept her head in the same position. I thought with age, her hearing would have faded and she didn't hear the question, so I began to repeat it before she interrupted. "I heard you the first time. Child, you might not know it, but there's a lot of evil in this world. And just how it has good things to help us and guide us, there is the bad that tries to distract us and keep us scared. Out in that bush, It has some of those things, and hearing your name is only giving them too much information. I sat listening to her with wide eyes. Most of my life, my mother told me the superstitions of ghosts was just nonsense. In the city with our cars and electric lights, it was easy to dismiss these fears with the flick of a switch, as easy as the light would push back the shadows. But out here, Mammy Yuen's slow words had an eerie quality I just couldn't shake, not even with all the lights in the world. "These are spirits you're talking about. They live in the bush?" I asked. "Yes, boy. They live out there. Some of them take the physical fleshy form of some nasty little things. Human-animal hybrids. The worst is the Duans. Them is the spirit of the babies that was never baptized. They walk around with their feet back turned to show they're progressing backwards with age." I raised one eyebrow at the thought of this. I wasn't very versed in folklore, so this was the first that I'd ever heard of them. "Have you ever seen one?" I asked. "Nah. Years ago, there was a woman that used to live in another village. She used to walk down to the river to wash her clothes, and on her way back, she saw a basket with what she thought was a baby crying inside. She wanted to know what beast would abandon a helpless child on a dirt track in the bush, so she picked it up and decided to carry it home. A little ways down the road, she started to feel the basket getting heavier and heavier in her arms, until she couldn't carry it anymore, and the baby's cries were replaced with a deep masculine voice that told her, 'You better put me back where you found me.' Well, child, she dropped the basket with whatever was in it and took off down the road and never looked back. In the end, it took 2 doctors and a priest to try and calm her down, but she ain't never been right since," Mammy Yuen said as she tapped the side of her head. As unsettling as this story was, even at my age, I was still skeptical. The eyewitness account of one obviously traumatized woman, who probably didn't have a proper education, wasn't enough to convince me of what was going on. "And do you believe that?" I asked timidly. She turned and I could see what looked like anger in her eyes. The warm maternal presence was gone and her mood shifted entirely. "Boy, even though I wasn't there, I see some things in this life. Your father could tell you too. He might pretend to forget or don't know, but trust me, he remember." I thought of my father's facial expression on the way here when he described his own experiences. It was weird, and clearly, both he and Mammy Yuen weren't giving me the whole story. I was curious, but she wasn't in the mood to answer any more of my questions. "It's getting late. You should go and sleep. I'll wake you for breakfast tomorrow and we can take that walk. Wash up and say your prayers." I felt like now I had more questions than answers. I lay awake, listening to the breeze blow across the branches of the trees outside. A few forest noises and what might have been the trickle of a few streams, but nothing else. As I lay awake in bed, thinking about what Mammy Yuen had told me, and trying to piece together from my early childhood memory what could have been responsible for such apprehension and strangeness from both her and my father. Sleep came, but it was heavy and restless. I woke up with a headache the following day, covered in sweat, to see the first rays of light peeping through the window. I could hear movement in the kitchen downstairs, and I went down to see Mammy Yuen cooking breakfast. After a surprisingly quiet breakfast, we washed up the wares and got ready for this hike. By this time, the sun was just a little bit over the horizon and bathed the entire forest in a lovely green-gold hue. I sometimes remember that glow in my days in this old gray building of death, and I yearn for it. Right now, it only exists in my mind. During the walk, Mammy Yuen showed me some of the native plants and what they were used for. Everything from treating urinary tract infections, fever, to even a quick poison. It was very educational until we reached a clearing in the forest. You know your father had a brother. Of all the things I was expecting her to say, that was not one of them. I was about to ask her to repeat. I was so sure I didn't hear what she had said when she continued. His name was Warren. He was a year younger. I never heard of my father mentioning siblings of any kind, so this was a shock. Years ago, when they were about your age, they were out here playing, exploring, and they got lost. We thought that they just lost track of time, but we eventually found your father, and he was petrified. Eventually, all the men and boys in the village gathered up torches and lights to go look for Warren. We even got help from some of the officers who had trucks to drive through those dirt roads. We must have looked through those bushes for weeks, even months before they eventually gave up. I could only listen and watch as the first drops of tears run down her wrinkled cheeks. We thought that he had just died and was never found, until your father finally spoke up and told us what had happened while they were out there. He said that the Duans appeared around them, one by one in a circle, and started playing with them. He said from the top half they looked like normal children. They couldn't see their feet because of the underbrush in the forest, but they got to a clearing like this when they saw their twisted legs and they tried to run. And that's when they grabbed my sons. Your father said he fought to get away and ran back, but he left Warren behind. They'd take my child, she yelled into the forest before her voice descended into sobs. I was dumbfounded. If what my grandmother was saying, I had an uncle who disappeared in these bushes decades ago. No wonder my mother was apprehensive about me coming here. But with something as traumatic as that incident, why would my father allow it? No, encourage it. I still had my skepticism about this whole issue. Ghost children didn't abduct my uncle. Rural areas like these I reasoned had more than enough ways to die without the supernatural being involved, so I quickly dismissed the idea. But if that was the case, well, then why was his body never found? Drowned in a river was one thing, but on an island as small as Trinidad, one was bound to find the dead body of a child sooner or later. In the end, I could only arrive at the conclusion that none of this made any sense. Mammy Yuen composed herself before looking at me still emotional and said, Don't worry, just stay near the house and you'll be safe. This is still a good place. I wasn't so sure anymore. In my 10-year-old brain, there is a mask over this part of the country. One that I only got fleeting glimpses of in moments like these. We walked back to the house in silence. While my grandmother prepared lunch, I decided to do some exploring on my own. I thought a few wildflowers and fruits would be enough to console my grandmother from having to recount such a horrible thing. And so I wandered into the track much further than I should have, in search of some wild orchids. Before long, the sounds of the forest came under a heavy silence. No parrots, monkeys were around. Even the wind seemed to avoid this particular patch of trees. I thought about what could have caused this when suddenly, I felt dizzy. It was strange. I wasn't hungry, nor was I even moving. I just felt disoriented without literally doing anything. When I found my footing, I saw in the distance some matted black hair poking out from behind a log. I looked closer and I realized that it was a little boy. He didn't seem to be lost. In fact, he seemed quite comfortable out here. Maybe it was the neighbor's child, but the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away and I doubt anybody would walk this far up the road. When the boy or the thing turned, I felt my stomach sink as my entire world was turned upside down. Instead of a pair of normal legs, the boy's toes were facing backwards as both legs appeared to be sickeningly twisted at the kneecaps. He turned his face and I saw it, horribly distorted as his eye socket sagged and his lips trembled, uttering something that resembled "Hoop, hoop, hoop." It screeched louder as it got closer, its backwards legs not slowing it down as it scuttled towards me. As terrified as I was, I remember whispering, "Oh God," beneath my voice just before turning to run. I could not bear to turn around and see how close that thing was to me, but I could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling, with that awful hoop sound just behind me. Pure fear coursed through my body as it leapt over branches and over trees to get away. In the distance, I could hear Mammy Yuen calling me towards the edge of the tree line. I raced towards her as I gradually heard the footsteps and sounds fade away behind me. I burst out of the bushes with such a force that Mammy Yuen jumped back. "Boy, where was you? You know how long I ring in this damn bell?" I was. Before she continued, she saw the look of fear and bewilderment on my face. "Oh God, are you okay?" she asked as she wrapped her arms around me. "They're real," I could only say between pants and sobs. She led me inside and tried to soothe me. Apparently what I thought was only a few minutes in the forest was actually 3 hours. By the time that I was inside, the sun already began to dip below the horizon, leaving behind an eerie orange-blue glow in the clouds. "We don't have any phone down here and it's too late to go to the store, so I'll call your father to come pick you up first thing tomorrow." "Oh God, the same thing. I didn't want it to happen," she lamented. I couldn't eat a bite of dinner. I kept thinking about that thing's face, how distorted it seemed and its legs. A shudder ran up my spine and I felt my stomach turn again. Before long, I went to bed. I tried to think of the things I liked: cricket, coconut water, fishing with my friends, anything to get my mind off of that thing, but it was to no avail. So if these things were real and they were responsible for my uncle's disappearance, what did they do to him? Was he their prisoner or was he eaten by them? Why have none of these things ever been captured? I know that they were supposed to be ghosts, but what I saw this afternoon looked oddly physical enough. These thoughts did not bring back rational thinking. They erased it. And then it occurred to me. During my escape in the bush, Mammy Yuen was calling me. She called my name. Unlike the night before, I couldn't hear any wind brushing against the trees, no forest animals, not even the stream seemed to make any noise. I had just reached for the oil lantern on the nightstand when I saw the dark figure leap through the open window in a flash. Straight through the window and out of my bed, it landed on top of my chest. It was one of those things. Despite its relatively small and lean frame, it was strong. Its slanted eyelids had no eyes underneath. They were just empty sockets, and I could see its mouth making the hoop noises. I was terrified beyond belief as it began strangling me with its dirty, hard hands. I was forced to look at its hideous face, and then it shocked me when it spoke in a deep tone. "I knew you would come back, Wendell. I knew that I would have gotten you eventually." How did it talk? How did it know my father's name? I could feel myself losing consciousness just as Mammy Yuen burst into the room. Shouting psalms in French Creole, she was armed with nothing but her heavy black Bible in one hand and a machete in the other. "You not going and getting another one, you wicked thing," she screamed. The thing began cursing before releasing me and jumping through the window back into the darkness. I eventually slipped into unconsciousness after that. I have faint memories of my grandmother carrying me to her room and rubbing my chest and neck with eucalyptus and other sweet-smelling oils, before eventually holding me close and rocking me to sleep. I awoke the next morning. After another silent breakfast with my grandmother, she took me to the nearest supply store where she called my father. I waited outside as she instructed him to come and get me. During the conversation, I heard her use the words emergency and a repeat before she eventually hung up. In about 30 minutes, I saw my father's car pulling up to the driveway of the store. "I really wish your stay could have been better," Mammy Yuen said before reaching and pulling me into a hug. She looked and she sounded so sad. "I know, I just don't know what to say, Mammy. Thanks," I said softly. She let me go as I hurried over to the front seat. My father looked about 10 years older as Mammy Yuen brought my father up to speed on everything that had happened. His look of fear was quickly replaced with sorrow when he looked back at me in the passenger side seat. I never saw my father cry before that day, and I never saw him cry again after that. It was a powerful image that moved me to tears as well. Before long, I saw my father walk back over to the car, and without saying anything, put the car in drive and began reversing out of the driveway. I saw Mammy Yuen raise her hand and gave me a wave. I returned it, knowing that this would be the last time that I would ever see her. The 3-hour drive back to the port of Spain was excruciatingly silent. On at least 36 occasions, I wanted to start a conversation with my father about what had happened, about what he saw growing up, about something. He only spoke once as he approached our house, and it is something that stays with me now, even as a decomposing old man. "He was your age, Warren. They took him in that forest and they'd never let him go. They wanted me too. I don't know why, but they came on the night that your mother was pregnant, and we were in Sangre Grande. It came and it offered me Warren back in return for you." I couldn't help it. I was so overcome with fear and raw primal emotion while sitting. My throat burned and I felt my eyes water. "Why did you send me, if you knew that they wanted me?" I asked. He replied without looking at me. "I wanted to know if they would keep the promise," he said softly. I sat in silence. In the days that followed, the years that followed, my father and I spoke less and less to each other. About 2 years later, I heard that Mammy Yuen had died of a heart attack while walking down to the corner store. She was 102 and still full of life and energy. The entire family had buried her in Sangre Grande under special rites as per her last request. I did not attend. A few years after that, I passed my last secondary school examination and I earned a scholarship to study medicine in Florida. I eventually met my wife and I got married. Despite repeated pleas from my mother to come back to Trinidad, I never did. But I did move her to the US with my family when my father died. I can't even remember our final conversation. Only that he ended it with how sorry he was.